You got your Bibles. We're going to start today in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, if you want to be turning over there. When you go and take your car to the mechanic and you say, I'm going on a long trip and I want to make sure everything's right, it's all working order, you take it down to Jim Ballou at Mile Tire and Brake, and he goes through it, has the mechanics look over it, he gives it back to you. He knows something's wrong, right? Something's off. But he doesn't want to hurt your feelings. He doesn't want to offend you. And so he says, hey, you're good to go. Have fun on your trip. But you get going on your trip, and you start going down a hill over in the East Tennessee mountains, and your brakes don't work. And you run off the road because you figure out you don't have any brake fluid, and so it's just not going to work right. And you go back to Jim Ballou, and you say, man, what happened? I thought that you were going to check my car out and thought we were going to be good for this road trip. You almost had me killed. And Jim Ballou says, well, I didn't want to hurt your feelings. I knew your car was wrong, but I didn't want you to get upset with me, and so I didn't really tell you the truth. We wouldn't like that, right? Or say you go to a doctor, and the doctor says, hey, you look good. I ran some blood. Everything looks good. When deep down, the doctor knows there's something wrong here. I'm not sure what it is. And then you go home, and you're going upstairs to go to bed that night, and you fall out because you're, not really in good health. Your heart's about to give out. And so you go back to the doctor, and you say, what happened? I thought that you checked me out, you did my blood work, and everything looked good, and then I pass out, and I got to go on this new medicine, and the doctor says, well, yeah, something was off, but it's your body, and I didn't want to upset you about your body, and I didn't want to, offend you for your body, and so I didn't tell you the truth. We wouldn't like that either, would we? Because there are certain times in life where we need truth. I don't need somebody to gloss over it. I don't need somebody to worry about offending me sometimes and not tell me really important facts about life. I don't need somebody to not want to offend me and not share with me truth that's really needed in my life. Here's the problem with that. That sounds great on the surface. But we live in a world that seems like it's offended about everything. Everything's offensive this day. Everybody's offended. Everything can be offensive. And that's the way that we have to navigate life sometimes. So we're going to talk about it a little bit. All right, yeah, there are some things that are offensive in our world. And there are times that we get offended by what people do to us and how people treat us. There are things that happen in our lives that we don't really have control over, and they offend us. But today I would like for us to approach it not from I'm offended, but what if starting out this series, I'm the offender? What if I'm the one who's offensive to other people? That's a question we got to discuss. It's a question that we as Christians need to be thinking about a little bit. All right, offenses are going to happen in life. And there are typically three ways that I see people respond to offenses. One of them is people fight back sometimes. We don't like what's happened to us. We don't like what they said. We don't like what they did. And so we retaliate and seek revenge. That's what I mean by fighting back. Another way to deal with offenses is to act like it never happened. To sweep it under the rug, to kind of ignore the elephant that's in the room. All right, they said something, they did something, a decision was made that is offensive to me, I can just ignore it. What I see a lot of times is when an offense happens between two other people who are not me, a lot of times there's, let's get the popcorn and see how this thing plays out. Let's watch it, because everybody likes a train wreck. We like to see people sometimes go through troubles, and we like to see fights happen. We like to see people who just go back and forth with each other. Those are the three ways that I typically see people respond to offenses. But what if there's a fourth way? What if there's a way to engage in offensive things that can be offensive things and engage in it in a way that's not fighting back, that's not ignoring it, that's not just watching from afar and not engaging at all? But what if there's a way to engage in possibly offensive things but not become enraged and not enrage other people? Because let's face it, Christianity from day one has been an offensive religion to a lot of people. Not just in our day. We talk about a lot of things in 2020 and 21 and 21st century stuff, and we all get offended about every little thing that happens. But even in the early days, like in day one of the church, it was an offensive call to those people. And whenever Peter and John and the apostles are going around Jerusalem and that area around there, they call people to change their lives, and that could be offensive to them. And when Paul, really, when he gets going and goes on all his missionary journeys to these people who've never heard about Jesus, who are worshiping in totally unacceptable ways, two unacceptable pagan deities, It's an offensive call for Paul to go and say, you got to change your ways. This is not how you ought to be. That could be offensive. They didn't really fight back. They didn't ignore it. They didn't step back and grab popcorn and watch it all play out. They engaged and sometimes found ways to do that without enraging others. And so I got to think about this from our perspective. We have a Christianity. It's a call to live a better standard of life, to adhere to a higher set of principles that can be offensive to other people. So how do we live it out? How do we speak truth in a world that seems to sometimes be offended by truth? I've got to look inside. We've got to look inside and figure out, okay, who's the jerk here? And you may be offended that I used the word jerk. Jesus used words that people were offended by. Paul went a little further than that, so don't be offended by that. But it's a legit question, and it has to start with us. Because maybe from our perspective, we see how other people are, and we think, what a jerk. How does he treat people that way? And I really need to think about myself before I think about others. Scripture's principle is, there may be a speck in somebody else's eye, and you can point that out, but there may be a plank in my eye. And I can't worry about somebody else's speck before I deal with my plank. I got to worry about me before I worry about anybody else. And so I want to give you 3 questions to ask, maybe this morning, to figure out who may be at fault in the offended situation. Who's at fault here? Number 1, let's turn in our Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, if you're not already there. 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Let's address the question of, do I think diversity is a good thing, or do I think diversity is a bad thing? Now, 1 Corinthians 12 is written to a church group. It's Paul writing to the Corinthians who have a lot of issues and a lot of problems and, a lot of things they need to address. And here's what he tells them. In verse 12, just as the body is one and has many members, all the members of the body, though many, are one body, and so it is with Christ. For in one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, we're all made to drink of the Spirit. For the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I don't belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I don't belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? And if the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? You get the idea. And he says that God has arranged the members in the body, each one of them as he chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, yet one body. And then he goes and says, one part of the body can't say, hey, we don't need you, hand. We legs have it covered. We don't need the hands. No, nobody does that. So church context. And Paul says, you're a lot of different people in the church, but you make up one body. And there's diversity in the church, and that's a great, great, great thing. We're all equipped in different ways in the church. We're all talented in different fields in the church, and that's great. Because if everybody's like me, there's a lot of things that are getting undone. If everybody's like you, there are a lot of things that we're not equipped to do. And so within the church, diversity is good. But you can also apply 1 Corinthians 12 a bit more broadly than that. If the only people that I ever listen to are people that agree with me, then how do I grow? If the only people that you ever listen to are people who reinforce what you already believe, then how can you see what's maybe in your blind side? How can you see what maybe you're missing in your life? I remember early on, I had graduated from Freed-Hardeman and had started taking some classes at another place. And one of the instructors at this new place said, you need to go in your library and take out all the books that are not written from members of Churches of Christ. And at that point, I thought, hey, that may be good advice. I don't want to get any, bad information. But the more I thought about it, I don't like that advice. Because I want to understand all sides of a view to figure out what truth is. And if I'm only listening to people who already agree with me, or I already agree with them, then I'm not growing. Then I'm not finding what I need to find. Diversity is good. Echo chamber is bad. But maybe we become offensive whenever we think that diversity is a bad thing. We become offensive maybe in how we talk and how we live and how we act if we think that everybody ought to be like us and everybody's opinion ought to line up with my opinion and everybody ought to think just like I think and act just like I act. And if you don't, then I'm against you. And so question number 1, if I'm going to try to figure out who's at fault here, who's offensive here, I need to think about myself. Do I think diversity is a good thing, or do I think diversity is a bad thing? Does it help me grow, or does it make me stagnant? All right, Matthew chapter 5, let me give you another question. Verses 38 through 48. This is the Sermon on the Mount. This is Jesus himself speaking. Greatest teacher ever lived. One of the ones who lived who had the most opponents of anybody who ever lived. Jesus was one of those people that you either loved him or you absolutely hated him because of what he taught, because of what he stood for. Well, these are the words of Jesus when he's talking to some of his closest followers pretty early on in his ministry and trying to show them what his religion is about. Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 38. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But if I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, then let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go 2. Give to the one who begs from you. Do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. Verse 43. He says, you've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Pretty common thought. I like people who like me. I treat people pretty well if they treat me pretty well. And many of us, maybe most of us, have a hard time doing good to people who do evil to us. It's not natural. It's not human. A lot of us have a hard time in helping people who hurt us. That's who Jesus is talking about, disagreements. He says, I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who's in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. If you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Don't even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Don't even the Gentiles, the unbelievers, he says, don't they do the same thing? Therefore, you must be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. All right, if we understand that there's diversity in the world, and it is, everybody's different, right? We got different opinions and thoughts, actions, attitudes, etc. That means that we're going to have some disagreements because we're a diverse people. Within the church, all kinds of opinions, all kinds of thoughts. Outside, even more. So there will be, just the fact of the matter is, there will be people that I disagree with. The question is, how do I treat those people that I disagree with? I'm not talking about like we disagree about if 72 is the perfect temperature or 68 is the perfect temperature. I'm talking about real world, big disagreements that we fight about, that we argue about, that keep us up at night. How do I treat people that I disagree with? Do I view disagreement maybe as a beneficial, helpful thing, or is it always a negative? One of the wisest men who ever lived told us one time that iron sharpens iron. Just like a man's conversations with another sharpens both of them. Iron sharpens iron. On one hand, he's telling us none of us are as sharp as we need to be. He's also telling us that as we disagree and as we discuss our disagreements and not just cast everybody off because we don't think the same and not just write everybody off who doesn't have the same opinion as me, if we can engage in dialogue, then we can grow. Iron still sharpens iron. One of the things that Jay back there said a long time ago, I don't even know if you remember this, Jay, but it stuck with me. You said, hey, if we're all in a room and everybody agrees and we all think the same, we all have the same thoughts and opinions, then what am I there for? And I've thought about that several times over the years, and it makes sense. A little bit of disagreement is good. A little bit of diversity that leads to disagreements is good. The question is, what do I do with it? How do I treat people that I disagree with? Do I cast them off? Do I treat them as an enemy? Do I just say, hey, we're not like each other, we're going to agree to disagree, we're just going to let each other go their own ways? Or do I try to grow? Do I try to help? Do I try to focus on who I am, or do I try to always just win an argument? Do I think that winning an argument is more important than sharing truth in love? So who's at fault? Who's offensive? Well, I need to think about how do I treat people whenever we disagree. All right, let's go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. This is the third question. I think this will be the last one we talk about this morning. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Paul is writing to the same church that he wrote to just a few minutes ago in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And he's talking to them about some really good things. All right, let's just pick up here in verse 1. He says, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. Well, in their day and age, speaking in different tongues, especially the tongues of angels, was a pretty coveted gift. Everybody wanted that one. It was showy. It showed that the Spirit of God dwelt within you. And so that's, inherently not a bad thing. Verse 2, if I've got prophetic powers and I understand all mysteries and I've got all knowledge and all faith so as to move mountains, but have not love, Paul says, again, I am nothing. Well, if you take those point by point, the ability to prophesy to them was a great thing. To understand mysteries, who doesn't want to understand mysteries? To have all knowledge and faith. I mean, faith is definitely important in Christianity. So Paul lists out those things. And then in verse 3, he says, if I give away all that I have and I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, then I gain nothing. Okay, sacrifice is good. Giving things away is good. It's sacrificial. It's selfless. It's helpful to people. It's a way to do good in our world. All right, so those are the things that Paul lists. Not one of them in those first 3 verses is inherently bad, unless the way that we live is overriding that. Have not love. Especially in verse 1. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but I have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. You know what he's saying? You ever try to talk to somebody and you're trying to have a conversation, but it's really loud in the place, and you can't hear what they're saying, and they got to repeat themselves 6 or 7 times, and then finally they're frustrated and you're frustrated, and the conversation's going nowhere. You know what I'm talking about? All right? That's the point that Paul's making. All right? You can't hear each other. They can't hear what you're saying because the way you're living is overriding your words. The way you're living is overriding the words that you're saying. Paul says, look, it doesn't matter what I say. I could speak with the best tongues. I could share the best message. I could preach the best sermon, teach the best class, have the best conversation. But if my life overrides the words that I say, they're just not going to hear it. And that's when he goes into the discussion in verse 4, that love is patient, it's kind. These are actions, okay? It's patient, it's kind. It doesn't envy, it doesn't boast, it's not arrogant, it's not rude, it doesn't insist on its own way, it's not irritable or resentful, and it goes on and on and on. So think about it. This is what Paul is saying. Let's just say I am a very impatient and, let's say the opposite of kind, mean. I'm a mean, impatient person. Theoretically, let's just, hypothetically speaking, right? And I come and say, hey, I want to tell you about the love and the mercy and the grace of Jesus. You're probably not going to listen because it's not, my life has overrid the words that I've said, okay? Makes sense, right? Or let's just say I'm always envying what you have, or I'm always boasting about what I've got, and I come to you and I say, hey, the message of Christianity is sacrifice. And I've got to give up some things if I want to seek after Jesus. It's not really going to make sense, right? Because you know me and you know how I live, and the way that I live is overriding the words that I'm saying. Or I say, hey, I don't say this, but I'm an arrogant person, or I'm just rude and I don't treat people very well. I always want my own way. It's my way or the highway. But I go to you and I say, hey, sometimes you've got to give in. Sometimes you have to, find some middle ground. Sometimes you've got to make a sacrifice on your end. Doesn't make any sense. You're not going to listen to me. You're actually going to think, what a hypocrite he is. He's the jerk here. You're going to think, why would he who lives that kind of life come and try to speak truth to me? That's offensive. Of course it is. Not because it's not true, but because the way I live overrides the words that I'm saying. So we live in this world where everybody's offended about something, and I get it. But maybe we can, lessen that blow a little bit. I'm not saying Christianity is not an offensive religion, because it is, especially in our day. You want to talk about what's offensive in our day more than it was maybe years and years ago? You want to talk about the Bible's commands about sexuality? Those are offensive to our culture. You want to talk about the Bible's teachings about wealth and money in our culture? Those are incredibly offensive to people. They're still true. It's still valid. It's real. Jesus still said those things. But maybe I need to think about. People don't always think like I think. but diversity is good. And because there's diversity, because there's differences in opinion, I'm going to have some disagreements. And the question is not, are those disagreements going to come? The question is, how do I treat people when I disagree with them? And as I try to speak truth, and as we try to shine the light, and as we're salt in this world, we got to think not just about what we say. And, people get offended about what we say sometimes. And maybe it's because the way that I live is overriding the words that I say. Christianity is an offensive religion. It should be. It should call us to a higher standard. And that's offensive sometimes. It should call us to put away some things that we're engaging in right now. And if you're doing that, that's offensive to you. I get it. But Jesus comes, and he shares this message. His example is that whenever people did disagree, he understood a diverse population. When they disagreed with him, many would listen because of how he lived his life. Whenever there were disagreements between Jesus and others, most of the time it's not from people who didn't live out the gospel as he was teaching it. Most of the time it was the incredibly religious people already who had squandered their faith and who were wrecking the religion that God had come to set up. So look at the example of Jesus, and let's try to apply some of these questions, or maybe the answers to these questions, in our lives. It starts not with them, not with everybody who's offended. It starts with me. And what am I willing to give up for the people that God has called us to love? What sacrifices am I willing to make for the people that God has called us to love? What am I willing to forego so that I can have a conversation with somebody about their lives, about God's call on their lives, and about their need to respond to God? Sure, we live in a world that's offended. We live in a world that seems to be offended about every little thing. But maybe we can do our part. It starts with us. Maybe we can do our part. Look at diversity not as a bad thing, but as a growth opportunity. To look at disagreements and think about how I treat the people that I disagree with. To think really right here and right now about my life. I need to think about if the message that I speak with my words not connecting because of how I've lived my life. Maybe today is a day that you think, I need to do something about that. Because maybe my life, the way that I live, is overriding what I'm trying to say. Maybe the darkness in my life is clouding out the light that we're trying to shine. And so maybe people are offended by us. Maybe it's because of something we're doing that we could stop. Maybe today you're here and you're not yet a Christian. And it may be because the message of Christianity has been offensive to you because it calls you to something different than what you're doing. It calls you to make changes in your life that you're not comfortable making right now. And it calls you out of the darkness that you like and into the light that you're a little bit afraid of. But maybe today is the day that you decide, I'm putting all that behind, and we're going to make this thing right. Faith may be in Christ. You're willing now to turn away from a life of selfishness to a life of sacrifice. You're willing to turn away from a life that you're seeking what you want and you're seeking the will of God in your life. That's what the Bible calls repentance, to turn away from those sins, to turn towards Him. Maybe today is the day that you were baptized into Christ and have all those sins washed away, and you begin living this life where you're following Jesus with its teachings that may be offensive, but that are what we need. Maybe you're a Christian, and you've been one for a long time, maybe, I don't know. But maybe today is the day that you decide, my life has been overriding my words. I've not been treating people well, and you need to make that right. It doesn't have to be a public thing. It's something you're aware of in your mind. Maybe you've known it. Maybe you just figured it out. But maybe this is the day that you decide, I'm not gonna do that anymore. I'm gonna live like Jesus in this easily offended world. Today there may be some kind of response you want to make, some kind of needs that you have. We, your family here, we want to help you and encourage you and pray for you if that's what you want. And so